Hi, in this presentation we're going to be talking about The Diversity Paradox by Jennifer Lee and Frank Bean. I'm going to present this book in two different parts. The first part is going to look at the history of the racial divide and how we've historically measured race, and then we'll look at more contemporary patterns in the second part. But this is an important book because it's looking at the changing nature of the racial divide in the United States and the implications for how we construct race and racial boundaries. Now, this is an important question because now there are over 60 million people in the United States that identify neither as white nor black. And so the question is, how are these non-white, non-black individuals being treated in our society and how they identify? This echoes a very famous quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1903 said, "The problem of the century would be the problem of the color line." If you fast forward more than 100 years later, this is still a significant issue. How does our society deal with racial diversity? The book argues that there are two major factors that shape American history related to racial inequality, and that is slavery and immigration. While they saw slavery as essentially a scar of race, a scar on the history of the United States, they, on the other hand, saw immigration as representing hope and a prospect for success, and sort of how immigration was a very positive impact on the United States. But it wasn't until the 1960s that we began to see significant change in racial inequality. So some examples of this are the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which made discrimination against blacks illegal. Also, the Hart-Celler Act of 1965 abolished national origin quotas and really opened up a new type of immigration to this country. Prior to 1965, between 1924 and 1965, there's essentially cut off immigration to this country. And after 1965, there was a renewed emphasis on family reunification and immigration related to employment or one's occupation, and that really opened up the gates to immigration to this country, and it changed the nature of the racial composition of our country since 1965. Also in the 1960s, there were significant positive outcomes of the civil rights movement, including the Supreme Court case Loving versus Virginia, which essentially made it legal in all states for intermarriage, which there were 13 states at 1967 in which it was still illegal for whites to marry blacks, for example. Also, in the 1960s was the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, and these had significant positive changes in terms of racial inequality. Now, one of the guiding questions of this book is whether race is declining, and if it in significance, and if it is declining in significance, is it declining equally across all groups? Now, some scholars are optimistic and say that race is beginning to fade as a significant social concept or axis of inequality. Others are much more pessimistic, and the question becomes, what is the nature of the change with respect to the black-white divide? A particular interest is this group of, like I mentioned before, 60 million people are neither black nor white, this so-called new immigration to the United States, which is now comprised primarily of immigrants who are coming from Latin America, Asia, and the Caribbean. So to give you some context of how much things have changed, if you look back in 1970, just a few years after the change in immigration laws that took place in the 1960s, Latinos made up only 5% of the population in 1970, and Asians were about 1%. Fast forward to 2008, and those percentages rose to 15% for Latinos and 5% for Asians. Now, Latinos make up a larger proportion of the overall population than do African Americans. And the projections are that these groups are going to grow significantly. For example, by the year 2050, their projections are that Latinos would make up 30% of the population and Asians would make up 9% of the population. So the question then becomes, what about these groups? Will they be continued to be discriminated against? Will they be excluded in many ways that they have been in the past? Or is this changing nature of or changing composition of racial groups in the United States going to shape or reshape the boundaries that exist in a way that maybe could mirror what happened with the Irish in the past, about 100 years ago or so. So the number of intermarriages have also changed significantly. If you look at, it's over 20 times as many if you compare 1960 to the year 2000. So in 1960, there were 150,000 interracial marriages. That's less than 1% of all marriages. But in the year 2000, there were 3.1 million, and that was about 7% of all marriages. Also, as not surprisingly, there's been an increase in the number of people who identify multiracially. So in 2008, 2.2% of all Americans listed themselves as multiracial, but projections are that this is going to increase significantly. So by the year 2050, that number could increase to 20%, and projections have this percentage of people identifying as multiracial in the year 2100 as being as many as a third, or 33%. Lee and Bean look at these overall patterns and conclude that Asians and perhaps Latinos are following a pattern that earlier European immigrants followed, and that is that while they were not initially seen as fully white, that over time they became assimilated in increasingly seen as white. So if this is the case, Lee and Bean argue that there's a black, non-black color line that's emerging in our society. So the color line may be fading for some of these groups, but not for blacks or African Americans. They argue, Lee and Bean argue, that blacks continue to be relegated to a position of disadvantage. And so the new category becomes non-black, and that would be comprised of people who may previously been seen as Asian or Latino. So there's really three different theoretical perspectives about this. Historically, Lee and Bean argue that there's been a white, non-white divide. That is, and there's a lot of historical evidence to suggest this, that essentially whites are defined as a dominant group, and then other people are defined as non-white, and Asians and Latinos would be seen as non-white in this kind of system. Historical examples that lend credence to this perspective include the Chinese being barred from immigrating to this country in the late 1800s, the internment of over 100,000 Japanese during World War II, or the forcible deportation of Mexicans in the 1950s. Also, there's interesting histories of Asians and Latinos trying to be defined as white as a way to gain their citizenship. So here's some examples in the book that were detailed about a Japanese and then an Indian individual, and then also Ricardo Rodriguez, who in 1897 successfully was granted citizenship, but was not defined as white. Also related to this white, non-white divide is the creation of this concept in the 1960s, this umbrella concept of people of color. So in this case, we're combining Asians and Latinos with blacks, and to the degree to which our society embraces this concept of people of color, that is reifying a white non-white divide. That's not the only way to see this kind of divide. Bonilla Silva proposed that there are three groups taking shape here in the new racial hierarchy, and that is whites, and then so-called honorary whites, and collective blacks. And so Asians, for example, would be considered honorary whites, and perhaps some Latinos would, and then there would also be some groups of Latinos, perhaps, that would be seen as lumped in with the so-called collective blacks. A third possibility is what Lee and Bean argue is taking place, and that is the creation of a black, non-black divide. So groups such, like I said before, Asians and Latinos are becoming increasingly seen as white, and unfortunately this path doesn't seem to be opened up to blacks. That this does not seem to be the case for blacks. So what evidence suggests that? Well, multicultural blacks are, that is, people who are from multicultural backgrounds who have some black ancestry, are generally considered to be black in a way that multicultural Asians and Latinos are not, right? So Asian and Latino multiracial individuals are able to have a more flexible self-definition of what their racial identity is, and it's not imposed upon them as rigidly as it is for multicultural blacks. Also, these groups, Asians and Latinos, have never faced the level of racial residential segregation or discrimination that blacks have faced. Also, the intermarriage rates are significantly different, with blacks being much less likely to marry whites in comparison to Asians and Latinos. So Lee and Bean suggests this concept of black exceptionalism as the core principle behind this theoretical perspective of seeing a black, non-black divide emerging. That is, essentially, that blacks are the exception to this pattern where in the past the Irish have transitioned from non-white to white, and that they anticipate that Asians and Latinos would also transition this way, but blacks are the exception to this pattern, according to Lee and Bean. Related to these overall issues is this concept of a post-racial society that many people have adopted, this idea that now race is no longer imposed upon people, but rather we've gone beyond race, and ethnic behaviors are certainly just a choice. Many sociologists are quite critical of this idea of us truly being a post-racial society, but it has emerged as a concept out there. There's also interesting patterns when it comes to the changes over time of how race has been measured using the U.S. Census. And so we're going to take a brief look at those changes over time. There are only three categories that have been consistent across all of the U.S. censuses since 1790. That is, white, Chinese, and Japanese. Those have remained unchanged, but there's been a significant amount of change that has taken place for other groups. For example, if you're measuring black as a result of the Three-Fifths Compromise, that if you look at your history books, you'll recall that blacks were only considered 3/5 of a person up until the 1866 14th Amendment. There were concepts that emerged to describe individuals that were had some black ancestry or African ancestry. So the concept of mulatto or a quadroon or octoroon. Well, what are these? So a quadroon would be a person who had one of their four grandparents being of African descent. An octoroon would be one of the 8 great-grandparents, for example. These were the precursors to what has been described as the one-drop rule. several states in the South in 1910 adopted this legal rule of hypodescent, and that is the idea that if someone had any trace of African American or African blood, that they would be considered black. And this was adopted by nearly every state by 1925. This type of treatment of blacks was reified in our society all the way up until 1967. That's the year I was born, so it's not all that long ago. The Loving versus Virginia case, as I mentioned earlier, overturned laws that made it illegal for whites to marry blacks. So this is fairly recent that this has been outlawed in our society. Now, there's also interesting patterns when it comes to measuring so-called Mexicans. Mexicans were only listed once as a race in 1930, and what's interesting about this is that there were significant lobbying efforts and organizations, essentially social movements, to remove Mexican as a distinct race, and rather they wanted to have Latino ancestry be seen as an ethnicity rather than a distinct race, because they didn't want to be treated in the same way that that African Americans or blacks have been treated. So Hispanic is now officially treated as an ethnicity, not a race, and the vast majority of Hispanics report that their race is white or some other race. Only 6% of Hispanics report that their race is black, and Mexicans are more likely than any other Hispanic group to claim some other race. When it comes to measuring Asians, Asians were not only considered a separate so-called color than whites in the early 1900s, but they were also ineligible for U.S. citizenship. It wasn't until 1966 when Asians, when actually they used the term Orientals, which is now seen as a racist term, but that they were recognized as an official category, and so this changed to Asian Pacific Islander in 1977, and then 1980 several more categories were added. What's interesting about measuring whites is that the racial category of white has not changed at all since the first census in 1790. Essentially, white has not been defined. No one ever talks about what white it means to be white, but rather whiteness is defined as a process of elimination in which the census identifies all the other groups who are not white. So that gives you an overview of the first part of Lee and Bean's book. In the next presentation, we're going to look at the rest of the ideas presented in this book. But I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and if you have any comments or questions, please post it on our course website, and thank you for listening.